Hello, team, and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce's Ukraine War News Update for the 6th of June, 2023. Of course, a poignant day given it is the anniversary for the D-Day counteroffensive in 1944 into France for the Allied forces. And one might have been expecting perhaps a counteroffensive today as a symbolic gesture to that really important date in the Second World War from the Ukrainians. But there's a spanner that's been thrown in the works, and it's quite a big spanner. And the Russians have destroyed the Novokakhovka Dam that keeps the water back. It's a hydroelectric dam itself, but also keeps the water in a reservoir full for the Ernod nuclear power plant to keep that cool. And huge amounts of flooding is taking place as we speak. But I'll come to that later. It's a massive piece of news, so there's a lot to get through today. Let's go to our figures, our general staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before. All the usual caveats apply. 800 liquidated personnel, and that is reflective of the counterattacks that are taking place not only around Bakhmut, and they've ticked back up again, but also particularly indeed around Donetsk, so the Velika Novosilka area, as well as perhaps Pavlivka and Vuhledar too as well. So that's a significant change from yesterday, and indeed for the last month really. 12 tanks and 20 APCs is also a huge number of mechanized equipment to record. I've got some stats to share with you in a separate video later today, and an Excel spreadsheet I'm going to share with all of you, give you an open source link to that. I recorded it last night, but my face was over all of the video in the wrong place, so I'm going to redo it. Anyway, huge numbers there nonetheless. 36 artillery systems and 6 MLRS. That's a massive day for the Ukrainians and huge loss in terms of artillery pieces. The Russians still have a lot of artillery pieces, and the Ukrainians have been explicitly targeting them and also have a greater capability to do that as well. So we have seen a massive loss in that category, but they are still able, the Russians, to hit the Ukrainians on the as the Ukrainians commit to counterattacks and the counteroffensive with artillery. So it's really important that that stat keeps consistently high for the Ukrainians. 2 anti-aircraft warfare systems, 1 helicopter. That's a helicopter in, I think, the Donetsk region, Ka-52. 23 drones, 35 cruise missiles, 20 vehicles and fuel tanks, and 5 pieces of special equipment. Again, high across the board for all categories, really. But goodness me, APCs, tanks, personnel, artillery systems, and special equipment. That is the significant day for the Ukrainians. As I say, K-52 helicopter downed in the area of Horlivka, Shakhtarsk. So there is that's another loss for the Russians there. Now, during the night, air defense apparently destroyed all 35 cruise missiles. And I think that is what's included on the figures. You don't often get them included from the night before, but actually that must have happened early enough that they've been included on the figures. The Russians attacked with 6 strategic bombers flying over the Caspian Sea, releasing those cruise missiles directed towards the capital. Apparently they veered, they were sort of redirected. So I think it's trying to fool the air defense systems by flying them off in a certain direction, and then they all sort of veered towards the capital eventually. But the capital was Kiev was able to take them out. However, there is quite a lot of debris that was strewn across Kiev, causing fires and whatnot. So that doesn't mean that they're, if you destroy all cruise missiles, it's like that's problem solved. There are no issues. What goes up must come down. Okay, Russian state media, RIA Novosti, said yesterday about the events in Donetsk region, right? This is why I don't give you the Russian figures. Or when I do, it's because they're so fanciful, we can almost laugh in the face of the Russian MOD. So the claims for the Ukrainian losses, given their attacks around Velika Novosilka, so that's just to the west of Vuhledar down in southern Donetsk. Russian state media reports that the Ukrainian troops lost more than 1,500 personnel, so that's more than the personnel they used, 28 tanks, including 8 Leopard tanks, uh, 3 AMX-10s, and 109 armored fighting vehicles. It's just insane numbers, to the point that even Russian sources were taking the mickey out of their own claims. It's got to the point where some Russian mill bloggers recognize that they're just flat out lying. That's why I don't repeat these numbers on a regular basis. Now, yesterday in my threads, I had people saying, Leopard tanks have been abandoned, Leopard tanks have been lost, all this kind of stuff, which is repeating some of these Russian mill bloggers that are just repeating claims that go on and on. And there were some pictures of these Leopard tanks as well, except all the experts agreed that they weren't Leopard tanks. They were, if anything, AMX-10s. So a couple of AMX-10s were abandoned, broken down, not sure what had happened. And there was drone footage of them, and the Russians said that these are Leopard tanks, except they weren't. And those are repeated on my threads. So to basically any time a pro-Russian voice, a troll on my threads, says anything, the automatic response should be skepticism. Why? Inductive reasoning, because most everything that's been said before has been at least somewhat untrue. And here's another example. Anyway, this then leads to lots of memes. Of course it does, doesn't it? You know, guys, a Leopard 2 attacked us today. An entire division of Leopard 2 attacked us today. We destroyed 500 of them. Here's a picture. And a picture of just an old APC. And then, you know, is this Leopard? It's a butterfly. You get the point. What happens is people laugh at the Russians and then they're not taken seriously, and they do themselves a disservice, you know, from their own lies. Defmon says he's updated the list of Russian MOD claims. He's added about 13% of the estimated delivered Leopard 2s to the list. Now, this is a list that Defmon keeps updated, which is a list of stuff they claim to have destroyed that amounts to more than the equipment, more than the levels of equipment there are in Ukraine. So when it comes to, for example, M777 howitzers, they've claimed to have destroyed 192 of them, and only 153 have been delivered. So that's 125% of the M777. HIMARS, M142, 20 have been delivered. Russia have claimed to have destroyed 50. So that's 250% of them. M270, Mars, LRU, these are other multiple launch rocket systems. They've claimed to have destroyed 62% of them. And then Patriots claim to destroy 5 of them. Leopard 2s delivered 60, claimed to have destroyed already 8 of them, and we haven't seen any of them in the field. Bradleys, they're not even seen in Ukraine, apart from maybe on some training fields. Russians have claimed to have destroyed 5 of them. So again, take what the Russians say with a huge pinch of salt. And then it gets, you know, there are so many threads like this, but this is Andrew Perpetua again. Ukrainian losses in their attacks in Donetsk today amount to 145 million casualties, 63,694 tanks destroyed, 123,472 artillery pieces lost, 4,684 aircraft lost. It goes on, it goes on. And then typically the glyph of sealing was damaged by the Iskander strike, and more than 500 demons from Amraska broke into our dimension. 3 of them were destroyed with holy arrows, but the rest are running free. They are highly dangerous shapeshifters. Some people are curious how Ukraine can sustain such casualties. Please be advised that all NATO super soldiers possess the ability to regenerate a complete new body from a single drop of blood, so on and so forth. There are memes about, like, destroying the entire Starfleet in Star Wars, so on and so forth. So you get the point is that when you start having this kind of laughing in the face of Russian claims, you've got to think the Russian information space is being somewhat ruined by their own efforts. Okay, aside from all of that, there were strikes again with sort of storm shadows. You know, the storm shadows from the planes that are supposed to be blown up by the Russians. Well, they've struck Berdyansk, I think Melitopol, Mariupol again. All those kind of usual targets. Substation is on fire in Smazhnevo in the Kraj region. That's quite far to the east. So this looks like some kind of smoking accident. Power supply had been cut off in an emergency throughout the Zalazovsky district, and that is quite a substantial fire at that substation. Okay, so now we're going to move on to, before we get to the dam, we're just going to go north to In fact, no, let's go to the dam next. I think that's probably the wisest option. Right. So what has happened? Essentially, you have a massive, massive war crime has taken place. We have ecocide, we have civilians effectively targeted with this. Okay. So the dam Novokakhovka at Novokakhovka has been blown. A tidal wave of water will almost instantly flood well over 50 settlements in the Kherson Oblast. It will affect water supplies to Crimea and could threaten supplies to cool the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. Okay. So, oh, by the way, there were also S-300s sent at, those are surface-to-air missiles sent at Kharkiv. I meant to say that before as well. So Russia did do some damage to Kharkiv. Right. So Ukraine's Southern Operational Command reported early on June the 6th that Russian forces blew up the Kharkovka hydroelectric power plant. I mean, this is just shocking footage. Scale of the destruction, the speed and volume of water, and the likely areas of inundation are being clarified, the military said on their official Facebook page. It's just that is an absolutely massive amount of water. Now, this dam was at record levels. So I reported the other week or the other month that it was at record low levels. And since then, it has moved to record high levels. It's really up and down. The Russians are playing around with the levels there, it seems, and possibly waiting for this moment, leaving it, at record high levels so that when it blows, it causes the maximal amount of damage. And as you can see there, that is just a huge amount of water. Um, just lots of modeling of worst case scenarios of what would be flooded most. Now, most of the issue would come to the south. And this makes me think that this is a desperate move by the Russians here. Now, we'll talk about how terrible it is, how much of a war crime it is. But from a military point of view, it tells us two things. It one tells us how desperate the Russians are, and it's a kind of a desperate throw of the dice. But it also, you can argue, it's fairly well timed and quite a scare quotes good move from the Russians. So the Russians were really worried about the Ukrainians leading a counterattack across the Dnipro. It looks. I was going to report today about how some of the movements along the Dnipro look like they are getting ready for something. The Ukrainians, indeed, Rebar was talking about this yesterday and did a thread on it. Well, in light of that, and this kind of act just completely invalidates the Dnipro from being crossed by an attacking force. That's just out of the question. And what that then means is that the troops along the Kherson Oblast can be moved to support Zaporizhia much more, and artillery can be moved to support Zaporizhia. So I think that's quite a scare quotes clever move for the Russians. However, it is also incredibly terrible. So there's danger of flooding for the right bank of the Kherson region, but the most critical situation is on the left bank, which is where the Russians control. But again, this is why it shows a desperation, because they are actually going to ruin their own irrigation, their own agricultural irrigation, so they control that land. I think basically they were that panicked that they would lose that land that they've kind of resigned to losing it, so it's kind of a scorched earth tactic. Well, if you're going to attack us, we're just going to screw everything over by flooding this whole area, and that would then have long term issues for irrigation to the. And I suppose I really should show you where this all is on a map. So long term irrigation issues for the Russians in that area, but also for Crimea. So the canal that comes out near Novokakhovka is a canal that supplies Crimea, and therefore, Crimea is also has always had an issue with fresh water. Since 2014, when the Ukrainians cut off that canal, they had an issue with water supply, clean water, consistent water, so on and so forth. So when they then had the invasion in 2022, this was one of the first places they wanted. They wanted that dam so that they could resupply fresh water to Crimea. Well, actually, blowing this might cause some fundamental issues for that canal. I'm not sure, but also for the irrigation for this entire region. But also, it means that the nuclear power plant might well struggle to get water, enough water to cool its systems as this reservoir drops in levels, and that is a huge issue. But again, that speaks of the kind of desperation that the Russians might be feeling, and is represented by this move. So that is just absolutely massive, this news. There's no doubt about that. So as you can see, widespread ecological damage will be caused. This night, Russia blew up the dam of Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant. As a result of the detonation, the water level in the reservoir is rapidly decreasing, which is an additional threat to the nuclear power plant. Parts of the Kherson region have already been urgently disconnected from gas and electricity, and residents living near the river are being evacuated. It's just going to be entire communities washed away, especially in the Delta region. So all these islands I've been talking about so much over the last couple of months that have an awful lot of housing on there, as you can see all around here, these will be under a huge amount of threat. You've got bioreserves and all sorts. It is just an ecological disaster. Anyway, to return to that thread, President Zelensky's called an urgent meeting, and I don't know if that's taking place in Kryvyi Rih. Footage of the blown up dam. Thousands of civilians and animals are in immediate danger. This is pure terrorism again. Russian mines explode after washing ashore due to the dam breach. So that's something that's happening quite a bit. There's footage of that. And the first Russian military blogger admits that Russia is the one to blame for blowing up the dam. We're going to come onto the narrative in a minute. And this is how the streets close to Kakhovka look right now. Water is filling up the streets. Residents are trying to leave. As a result of the detonation, the engine room from the inside of the Kakhovka power plant was completely destroyed. The station cannot be restored. So Ukroydroenergo, the energy company that controls uh, the hydroelectric power plant, is saying that it is unsalvageable. That's the end of the power plant. You ain't getting that back. There's a beaver there. Looks. This is an ecological disaster. The world must respond immediately, but not just with words, but with actions. Russia should immediately withdraw from the nuclear power plant in order to avoid further catastrophe, says the Prime Minister Shmihal. Sorry. And there you go. You can see the expected. If we show you this, the expected damage. Now, that river going up there to the north is the Inhulets River, and at the moment, that river is flowing backwards. That's how much water has come out of the reservoir there. That this quite significant tributary here is flowing backwards. So huge issues. That's modelling there. Right, let's go on. There's so much to say. So this is the Inhulets River, and it is flowing backwards. And indeed, you can see the amount of here, I guess, ecological effect that this will have as habitats are destroyed and what just washed away. Not only that, but the pollution causes from all the human debris that is washed downstream, and a lot of that. And there'll be sewage. There'll be possibly things like oil and petrol and etc. etc. Russians know that their defeat in Ukraine is inevitable, says Tendar. The destruction of the dam is not only an act of desperation, but especially an act of terror and petty vengeance. A military component is negligible and actually, even by rules of engagement, a clear war crime, despite the fact that Ukrainian forces made some decent progress downstream because it primarily and indiscriminately hits civilians. This was also the point. The act of terror targets the civilian population in Kherson. Since day one, the good citizens of the whole Kherson Oblast defied the occupation. We all saw the pictures of Kherson City during the occupation, but it happened everywhere where Russians arrived. Russians have never been welcome. Ask any Russian soldier who was there, and in a quiet moment, he will spill the beans. There was no flowers, but pure hate, and later even bombs until the defeated Russian army was forced to flee in shame. It's no different in the still occupied territories south and east of the Dnipro River. The citizens in those areas are yearning for their liberation by the Ukrainian army, which is only a matter of time. Russians are furious that their lies told by the regime in Moscow are nothing but fairy tales. The Russians, or known as Muscovians, are hated in Ukraine, and for this the dam was blown up. It is a collective punishment for not yielding. Those Russian Nero orders do not come by surprise. They are acts of a dying regime and a defeated army. They're telling us that this war is about to end. The last chapter of this tragedy, which Russia has started in 2014, has been opened. The end of the war and Ruski Mir begins. Russian terrorists, the destruction of the Novokakhovka hydroelectric power dam only confirms for the whole world that they must be expelled from every corner of Ukrainian land. So there's a lot of people being super angry about this, as you can imagine. Not a single meter should be left to them because they use every meter for terror. It's only Ukraine's victory that will return security, and this victory will come. The terrorists will not be able to stop Ukraine with water, missiles, or anything else. All services are working. I have convened the National Security and Defense Council. Please spread official and verified information only, says Zelensky. And here we have, the energy company saying that the hydroelectric dam is done for. It's blown up. That's the end of it. As in the power station is not going to be functional. The water level in the Kharkov reservoir is rapidly decreasing, says Energoatom, the energy company that controls the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, which is an additional threat to the temporarily occupied nuclear power plant. Again, you've got so much footage of ecological destruction. It's just an absolute shame. Really sad. Now, the video shows 3 distinct blasts from emplaced explosives at the dam. Why this is significant is the Russians are making several actually mutually exclusive claims about what happened at the dam. They are claiming, the official claim initially was it was being overused and it basically collapsed type thing. Which seems inherently nonsensical. Anyway, the explosive detonation for this was bigger than the World War II dam busters breaches. Clearly, there's a lot of pre-placed demolition charges being activated. No missile in Ukrainian service can deliver that much explosive payload, nor in 3 distinct blasts. In other words, if the Russians are claiming the Ukrainians did it, which some now official claims are it was the Ukrainians that did it with multiple launch rocket systems, you just can't do that. Issues going forward, the nuclear power plant cooling once the water abates. Crimean Canal is fed from the reservoir. The dam destruction means Putin does not plan to keep water flowing to Crimea, i.e. he no longer thinks the Russians' armed forces can hold Crimea. Putin is acting like Saddam when he dumped Q-80 oil into the Gulf and torching wells. Wanton destruction with no useful military effect. This is not surprising. The Russian aim here is to lay waste to as much of Ukraine as they can if it can't be theirs. Putin is convinced that Russia will not have to pay for repairing the damage to Ukraine after the war because Russia is a decaying nuclear superpower. The irrational regime hypothesis of traditional regimes become more so under pressure now has a Russian confirmation, says Trent Telenko. Okay, so in order to kill, says Michael McKay, and cause misery to Ukrainians, Russian occupiers blew up a dam in Dnipro on the 6th of June 2023. In order to kill and cause misery to Ukrainians, Russian occupiers blew up a dam on the Dnipro on the 18th of August 1941. They've done this before. They have form. Just incredible. Okay, and here's a graph to show that the level was at record low and then went up to record highs. And it seems rather coincidental that it went to record high. The Russians were allowed it to go to record high. And then it suddenly broke down. It seems highly coincidental. Anyway, Interfax said originally the dam of Kakhovskaya hydroelectric power station in the Kherson region collapsed on Tuesday night due to the collapse of one support, a representative of the emergency services of the region said. The dam would not stand it if one support collapsed and flooding began, he said, adding that there were no attacks on a hydroelectric power station at night. In other words, the Russians' original position is that it just collapsed and there were no attacks. And then the mayor of Novokakhovka, Vladimir Leontiev, who was installed by the Russian Ministry of Administration when the city was captured in 2022, has stated that the destruction of the dam and hydroelectric power plant is a serious terrorist act conducted by the Ukrainian armed forces. But of course, they don't have the ability to do that. They just don't. Those are serious explosives detonating on the dam. He was also claiming around an hour ago that nothing was wrong and that the dam had not been destroyed. But I guess things change quick a lot. Lol, sorry. So he's claiming that nothing to see here, nothing to see here. Then it's the Ukrainians did it. Meanwhile, the Russians are claiming it was a structural issue and it just fell apart under overuse. Just yeah. Igor Shushko says Russia blowing up the dam is going to have severe consequences. The act equates to the use of weapons of mass destruction under international law. Quote, dams like the Dnipro Dam in Novokakhovka are protected by the laws of war and the Geneva Convention. Destroying it would be considered a weapon of mass destruction and an indiscriminate war crime. Article 56 of the 1977 Additional Protocol 1 provides, quote, works and installations containing dangerous forces, namely dams, dikes, and nuclear electrical generating stations, well, all of the above type thing, shall not be made the object of attack, even where these objects are military objectives, if such attack may cause the release of dangerous forces and consequent severe losses among the civilian population, which it does. Other military objectives located at or in the vicinity of these works or installations shall not be made the object of attack if such attack may cause the release of dangerous forces from the works or installations and consequent severe losses among the civilian population. And then that worst case model attached. Now, this is precisely why the Russians are parking lots of equipment underneath the nuclear power station in Honohadar, because they know that you can't attack the nuclear power station. It's kind of ring fenced, so you might as well keep a bunch of military equipment there. Well, that if they understand that there, then it seems, well, just highly problematic. Then that they are blowing up this dam here. Just it's terrible. Anyway, that is the biggest piece of news today, and that will be ongoing. That possibly will also scupper Ukrainian. Even if they weren't really planning to attack over the Dnipro River, it fixed Russian forces there, and it was possibly going to be a huge diversionary, a point of diversion for the Ukrainians, but they don't have that now. So that's why I think the Russians will have done that partly. Okay, now let's move on to what is happening around southern Donetsk region. So one reason why the Ukraine is likely focusing on Vuhledar and Velikonovo-Silka areas because Russia pulled units from there to reinforce the Bakhmut flanks. And the 40th and 155th Naval Infantry Brigades were not properly reconstituted after their failed February-March assaults on Pavlivka and Vuhledar. So again, this talks, so the success the Ukrainians are having around Velikonovo-Silka, where the Russians are claiming they've lost 1,500 troops and 1 million tanks, right? The reason they're attacking there, but arguably, is because of Bakhmut, and this is a success of Bakhmut. So Bakhmut is fixing Russian troops there. Russian troops have had to reinforce Bakhmut because it's being attacked on the flanks. It is doing its job of taking troops from elsewhere, which then leaves these elsewhere places vulnerable to counterattack. Thomas Tyner is talking about how, and this is the very positive kind of, you have a spectrum of really positive outcomes to negative outcomes. So negative being Russia will repel all of Ukraine's counterattacks and it will be, the counteroffensive will be a disaster. To Russia will rout. But actually that end of the spectrum where they'll rout, there's a really distinct possibility that could happen. I mean, we've seen in the Kharkiv counteroffensive that kind of happened there. This is far, far bigger. But the flip side is that Russia are far more prepared for this. They've built their defenses. So Thomas Steiner says, as Russia's army will be routed in the coming days, you will see lots of experts who non-stop preach that the Russian defensive lines will be difficult for Ukrainians to breach, do rapid U-turns and declare they always knew Ukrainians could do it. So I've said they will be difficult to breach, but I've never said that they won't be able to do it, just that it's more challenging than not being there. It's just kind of obvious, right? But if well organized, the Ukrainians should be able to overcome these challenges. And I also think there is a significant potential that the Ukrainians could that the Russians could capitulate, that they could rout. I think that is a possibility. Prigozhin now saying that he thinks Bakhmut will fall to Ukraine in 45 days. You can make this up. if things proceed as they are doing, 10 months to sack Bakhmut and a month and a half to lose it, almost like the ratio for how long it takes to get over an ex who's dumped you. Just full interview there, an hour interview. He's stinging rebukes of the MOD to the point where, well, we'll come on to that actually. Right. Exclusive Ukraine. So moving off that front, just a few bits and pieces before we go to Belgorod. Ukraine has cultivated sabotage agents inside Russia and is giving them drones to stage attacks, sources say. This feeds into the theory that the attacks on Moscow, probably, or more probably, the attacks on the Kremlin, where there were two drones that hit right in that central part near Red Square and so on and so forth, were carried out by forces from within Russia, sabotage agents within Russia who have been provided with drones, so on and so forth. So I'll look into this, I think, in an extra video at a later point, but that is something to consider. That is an interesting and significant article by CNN there. Shashank Joshi says, and this is pretty significant as well, although not unusual as well. So articles and broadcasts from outlets including NBC News, the New York Times, CNN, the New Yorker, and the Ukrainian digital broadcaster from Odessa have led to journalists having their credentials threatened, revoked, or denied over charges they've broken rules imposed by Ukrainian minders. One particular target of official Ukrainian ire has been the New York Times reporter Thomas Gibbons-Neff, a former U.S. Marine who drew particular anger when he reported that the Ukrainians were using banned cluster munitions. He had his credentials revoked and his renewal denied. You might say this is a huge problem. There should be freedom of press, but this is a war zone, right? And there's never been freedom of press around war zone. It's a carefully curated information space by both sides, really. I mean, Russia has absolutely no freedom of press whatsoever. They've got their state media giving you just overt lies that we talked about already today. The Ukrainian side have some press freedom, but the problem is when those press institutions bring out articles that they don't quite like, then they are revoking the credentials of those journalists. So it is still very heavily moderating the information that's coming out of there. Now, you can argue, you can be a free speech advocate here and argue this is absolute nonsense. You should have freedom to say whatever you like, whenever you like. Yeah, you try conducting a war. Okay, things are just different in war, and information space is super, super important. And in the same way you try and control territory and terrain, you also try to control the information space for reasons of morale, for reasons of operational security, for reasons of not wanting the enemy to get hold of information that is beneficial for them. So as Shashank Joshi continues to quote from the article, Ukraine's restrictions do not approach those imposed on the US press, for example, in the 20th century by its own government. Nichols noted in an interview during the First World War, almost 100 US journalists lost mailing privileges when censors ruled that they were undermining the war effort. And I'm sure you could find parallels with Vietnam and so on and so forth. So, yeah, that happens, but are we surprised? Probably not. Okay, hackers have put deepfakes. They've aired Putin on Russian TV, but deepfake Putin. That's when you can manipulate images and video of people such that it looks like them speaking. I mean, this is the where we're at in the world with the advancement of technology, that you can't trust what you're watching. So they put on Russian TV and radio ahead of Ukraine's counteroffensive, fake Putins. A fraudulent Putin declared a state of war and general mobilization in Russian regions bordering Ukraine, while a video by Ukrainian MOD was aired in occupied Crimea, which I told you about yesterday. Okay, so moving off those bits and pieces, we're going to move towards Belgorod. Belgorod is still an issue. This is just insane that this is continuing. So, but Gladkov, the Russians can't get a handle of the information space either, and they can't get a handle of Belgorod. There are now Novaya Tavozhanka is under control of the Russian volunteer groups. It's just incredible. So here is the mayor or the governor of Belgorod saying that who previously had said all the rebels have been driven back and we succeeded in repelling that attack, now saying uh, maybe not. Um, it's not looking good. Admitting that Novel, as I say, Novaya Tavazhanka is under the control of the Russian volunteers. Right, this chap is a Belgorod soldier who has released this video. Dear friends, I'm an ordinary soldier in Russian Federation armed forces. He gives his name, tells what brigade he's in, infantry, so you can check that all out. Until yesterday, we were on the border with Ukraine in Belgorod region. We came under the most powerful artillery shelling of our positions, including from those effing HIMARS. We received an order to hold position, which we did. A few hours after this, Ukrops, which is the Russian volunteer corps, a effing ton of Ukrops. We fired back and tried to repel them, but there were too many of them. We requested permission to retreat, but we were denied. As a result, we lost around 80% of our personnel and were forced to retreat without permission and without reinforcements. We left the border. After some time, the same situation occurred with two other groups. They mowed down entire regiments of our men. We are aware that our command knew everything in advance about the offensive on our positions. What are you expletive waiting for? Orders from above, but that we told you we will all die here didn't bother you? Colonel Kolchin, the blame for the death of our guys lays personally on you. You will not be able to wash off the blood from your hands until the end of your life, you effing peer. Because of you, we lost a large contingent of our personnel, lost a piece of the border, lost supply lines, a ton of people surrendered. You scum sat in your offices and waited. Now you yourselves will effing have to regain these positions, but now from the trenches, not from behind a desk. That's it from me. Thank you for your attention. So things are going bad up in Belgorod. Indeed, even worse, that a colonel has been killed. And as Thomas Steiner says here, I'm pretty sure Russian liberation forces are operating in Russia behind Russian lines in Russian uniforms and Russian vehicles and asking Russian troops to tell them where the Russian commanders are. Actually, this made me think. So this is a significant loss. They've lost VDV. So he's a paratrooper, I think, colonel. So a high-ranking official, high-ranking military man has been lost. Now, I'm starting to think this Belgorod thing is quite clever because you've got Russian people who are able to speak Russian, dress in Russian military uniforms, and cause merry havoc in the lines, but in the Russian lines. They're going to be able to pretend to be Russian soldiers to get close to people like a colonel. I mean, I don't know how this guy died. Apparently, he's in a firefight in Novaya Tavazhanka. But you can imagine that the Russian volunteer forces could cause tremendous problems in Belgorod. Moscow regime governor, who you just saw earlier, reports the loss of Novaya Tavazhanka. Earlier this day, Russian rebels reported that they had taken a town, so they're still, active there. And there's threads of all sorts going on of the losses. And then Riveron, which they attacked on the 22nd, 23rd of May last month, that again is being hit. Border crossing there was the first place that the incursion took place, and then it's being hit with further munitions. Russian volunteer fighters, there's images of them, images of fighting, Belgorod air raid sirens. It's just an absolute show, as No Report says here. Now, these Russian freedom fighters have appealed to Wagner, have appealed to Prigozhin to do a prisoner swap for the Russian lieutenant colonel that Wagner have captured of the conventional forces, or that whole thing that happened in Bakhmut, where the conventional forces were attacking the Wagner PMC because of all the animosity between the two. So they captured that lieutenant colonel and got him to do a confession on video. So these guys are now saying we'll do a Russian prisoner swap for that guy that you've got. Just, I don't know whether that's trolling or sort of being quite clever or whatever. Anyway, Novaya Tavazhanka under control of those rebels, if you like, so on and so forth, and even people in the sewer systems coming up from pro-Ukrainian soldiers coming up from the sewer systems. It's just like crazy stuff. Anyway, moving on from the kind of front line, military aid. Lithuanian defense minister has said that the country is preparing a new military aid package for Ukraine that will include millions of pieces of ammunition and anti-drone weapons. Australia, right, this is some big news from Australia. So well done, Australians. I feel like playing you a clip from. I mean, I've been to I backpacked around Australia for a year. There's a great, good old song by the Australian Crawl, Aussie Crawl, called "The Boys Light Up," about the politicians in the back room smoking cigars and doing their various things. But I reckon the boys have been lighting up and talking about ammunition and military aid now, because an about face from Canberra, which will now send Ukrainian Hawkey protection mobility vehicles. So they look like those sort of MRAPs type thing. Previously, Australia cited issues with the braking system as a reason they couldn't be sent, in spite of a big pitch for them by Kiev. Well, it looks like they're going. But not only that, this is big, and I just hope this comes through. Australia, the US, and Ukraine are discussing sending 41 Royal Australian Air Force FA-18 Hornets to Kyiv. So these would be useful. I've spoken about them before. They're fairly old airframes, but they're used to taking off from short runways because they're designed to take off from aircraft carriers, and they would be really, really useful for the Ukrainians to have, rather than sending them to the scrap heap as planned. Wow, if that happens, nice one, Australia. Nice one. Germany may reconsider its position regarding the possible supply of modern Western fighter jets to Ukraine. Defense Minister Boris Pistorius has said, nice one, Germany. The first groups of Ukrainian pilots began training on F-16 fighters in Great Britain, Dennis Schmihal said. Nice one, Great Britain. Although, let's get a little bit of qualification there. So Ukraine will be ready to deploy F-16s in a fall or winter, so autumn or winter, Defense Minister Reznikov has told the NHK. Meanwhile, PM Shmihal says the first groups of Ukrainian pilots have already been sent to the UK for training on the F-16. However, update, Ukraine Air Force spokesperson clarified, we are not talking about pilot training at the moment. The first groups of aviation specialists have departed and are studying the possibility of a further launch of training for Ukrainian pilots. I don't know what that means exactly. It could be that you've got people being trained for mechanics, logistics, or to input training programs, so training on the training, if you like. I don't know. It could be any one of those. Russians are bringing a load of hyacinth to bear. So this tells you that they're using old bits of kit, but still these things will hurt. You don't want one of those shells landing on your head, but it's another example of getting out fairly old kit. Those are towed howitzers. Right, geopolitics. This has been a long one. The US has imposed sanctions on 7 Russians for the role in the campaign of malicious influence in Moldova. The press service of the US Department of the Treasury has said. Also, 1 Russian company fell under US restrictions. That's really good. And Moldova is now recognized that all that, all the discord in Moldova was fomented by the Russians. And indeed, I have something else to say too. And yeah, sorry, the last thing was Belgium to probe pro-Ukraine militia using its guns inside Russia. So that's these Russian volunteer groups using Belgian guns. We've heard about Polish and American vehicles being used. Personally, I think I think America have probably done. Shrugging your shoulders should be the best response to this. I would just no one really would have noticed if Belgium hadn't said anything. So I would be turning a blind eye to that. It's like, this is war. Russia have massively invaded Ukraine. They've blown up a dam, for goodness sake. If you can't use a couple of machine guns in Belgorod to try and achieve the end of the war, then whatever. So anyway, but that is taking place. Anyway, thank you. I know it's a long one, but there's, my goodness, some massive bits of news have taken place. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. It really helps. Press the bell, and YouTube will probably not tell you anything, but that's YouTube. Take care. Speak to you soon.